Have you ever found yourself like really pondering why people do the things they do? Like, are they really accountable?
Yeah.
That's exactly what we are going to be doing today. We're acting as philosophers in the best sense, like diving deep into a question that really affects all of us.
Right.
And that question is, what does it really mean
Yeah.
to act responsibly, especially when we're not really aware of everything that we're doing?
That's such a good point. Like, think about all those times that you've thought, should I have known better? Or like someone else just wasn't aware of something and you're thinking, are they really to blame?
Right.
So like in this deep dive, our goal is to kind of explore this super fascinating idea from
Yeah.
philosophy. They call it the epistemic condition for moral responsibility.
Okay.
It might sound kind of academic, but it basically boils down to
Mm-hmm.
how much does our awareness
Right.
or like our lack of awareness
Yeah.
matter when we're deciding who deserves blame or praise. It sounds kind of abstract,
Sure.
but trust me, this is not just some theoretical stuff.
Yeah.
It actually sheds light on how we judge actions
Mhm.
every single day.
For sure. And to kind of guide our thinking today, we're going to be using a collection of all these really insightful philosophical explorations. And the central one for today is going to be the entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's super comprehensive, and it's on the epistemic condition for moral responsibility.
Okay.
It's a gold mine of different perspectives on this question. So, okay, let's dive in. When philosophers think about what makes someone morally responsible, they often land on two main things.
That's right. There is this concept of control. So
Mm.
like, did a person act freely? And then there's what we're focusing on today, the epistemic condition,
Okay.
or like the awareness part.
Yeah.
And while like we often talk about free will, the question whether we were actually aware of what we were doing, the consequences,
Mm.
the moral implications,
Yeah.
it's actually just as important and surprisingly complex.
Absolutely. So let's unpack that awareness piece. I mean, what kind of awareness are we even talking about? Like, philosophers have all these interesting categories. Why don't we start with the most basic awareness of the action itself?
Okay.
So think about the example of John and Mary on the treadmill.
Okay, so picture this. John is pressing a button. He's completely convinced that it's the light switch.
Okay.
But instead, it turns on the treadmill that Mary's on.
Oh, no.
And Mary falls and hurts herself. So like for John to be responsible, he needs to be aware that he's activating the treadmill while Mary's on it, or at least that his action is what's making her fall. If he genuinely and reasonably thought that it was a light switch, it feels wrong to just immediately blame him for Mary's injury.
But I think this is where things get really interesting. This is where we put on our philosopher hats,
Yeah.
because as the encyclopedia points out, John's ignorance, it isn't always a get out of jail free card.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So if John should have known what that button did, maybe there was a big obvious label he just didn't even bother to look at, then his very lack of awareness becomes something we might blame him for.
Uh-huh.
Philosophers call this culpable ignorance. And in these situations, the consensus among philosophers is that like the initial ignorance doesn't really excuse the harm that follows.
Exactly. So, like for John to be directly responsible for Mary's fall, not just indirectly because of his earlier blameworthy ignorance,
Mm-hmm.
he needs to be aware that he is performing the action under what they call an appropriate description. He needs to know, I am starting the treadmill with Mary on it,
Right.
or I am causing Mary to fall.
Right.
I don't
Okay.
know.
So that's the awareness of the action itself. But then we have awareness of moral significance.
Okay.
This is where we really start acting as philosophers. Like, what does it actually mean to understand right and wrong in the moment? Are we talking about like knowing the action is wrong, or are we just talking about being aware of the things about the action that make it wrong?
That's a good question. This is actually a really crucial distinction that gets to the heart of how we understand moral judgment. So philosophers talk about didicto awareness,
Okay.
which is this clear belief that the action you're taking is morally wrong as you understand it. So like in our treadmill example, John would have didicto awareness if he believes that pressing that button in that particular situation is, all things considered, morally wrong.
Gotcha.
But then there's degree awareness.
Okay.
And this is being aware of the specific features of the action that are in fact morally significant.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, the fact that it will cause Mary pain, regardless of whether John believes that these features make the action wrong.
So it's like the difference between I know this is wrong and I know this will hurt someone,
Exactly.
even if you don't think about that hurting as wrong at that moment.
Right. And there's a real debate among philosophers here. Does being responsible mean that you have to have that explicit moral knowledge, that didicto awareness? Or is it enough to simply be aware of the morally relevant features of what you are doing?
That's really interesting.
So, the key insight here is that
Yeah.
philosophers debate whether simply knowing you're hurting someone is enough for blame, even if you don't label that hurting as wrong in your mind.
Good point.
Yeah, some philosophers argue you need that explicit moral knowledge, that de dicto belief to be truly morally responsible. Others think that just being aware of the harm you're causing, the de-re-awareness, is enough.
Okay.
And this has some really big implications for how we judge people who might not explicitly recognize the moral wrongness of their actions, but are still clearly aware of the negative impact they have on others.
Right. Then we have awareness of consequences.
Okay.
This seems kind of straightforward at first. You need to understand that your actions will have certain outcomes, like, Mary ending up with a broken arm.
Yeah, it seems simple, but even here, philosophers get into some really fascinating details.
Okay.
So some philosophers argue that you need to be able to see the exact consequence that happens. So John needs to believe that there's a possibility that Mary might break her arm.
Uh-huh.
Others say that a more general belief is enough. Like, John believes someone might get hurt if he presses a random button with no label.
Okay.
And this is important. The encyclopedia emphasizes that this requirement is often framed in terms of reasonable foreseeability rather than detailed specific foresight. So the question is, did John have a good reason to think that harm could happen from pushing that button, even if he didn't specifically imagine a broken arm?
That's a good point. It's not about being psychic. It's about what a reasonable person in that situation would have thought.
Exactly.
Okay, so finally we have awareness of alternatives.
All right.
So this is the idea that to be blameworthy, you need to believe that there was at least one other option you could have taken, like a good option.
Right. So John would only be fully blameworthy if he believed he had the choice to not press the button, or like he could have asked what it did first or done something else entirely. But as the encyclopedia points out, this isn't like a universally agreed upon thing. Some philosophers think that even if you honestly believe you had no other choice, you can still be blameworthy,
Okay.
especially if that belief itself was from earlier blameworthy actions or failures.
That makes sense. So we've looked at all the different things philosophers say we need to be aware of. The action, the moral significance, the consequences, and the alternatives.
Right.
But the encyclopedia also explores the kind of awareness that matters. Is it enough to just believe these things?
Yeah.
Or do you have to know them?
Good question. This gets us to this classic thought experiment in philosophy. Dorfman the poisoner.
Yeah.
So, Dorfman, he puts arsenic in his wife's tea because he wants to kill her, and she dies. His plan goes perfectly. But get this. It turns out that Dorfman, he got the arsenic from this chemist that's known for being unreliable. So he doesn't actually know that it's arsenic. He just really, really believes it is. So his belief is true, and it's justified in his mind, but he doesn't have, certain knowledge. So the question is he less blameworthy because he didn't have that really solid knowledge?
I feel like most people will be like, no way, he's totally to blame.
Yeah, and like the encyclopedia points out, many philosophers think that actual knowledge isn't always needed for blameworthiness.
Okay.
Maybe just a genuine belief is enough, or a belief that's reasonable under the circumstances.
Interesting.
Yeah, and some even take it further, saying that belief doesn't even have to be true. If you sincerely believe that what you're doing is wrong and you do it anyway, some argue you're blameworthy just for going against your moral compass. It doesn't matter if the action is objectively wrong. Like, think about Huckleberry Finn. He thought he was sinning by helping Jim escape slavery.
Right.
But now most of us see his actions as morally commendable. So there's that tension between what someone believes is right and what is actually right.
And then there's the question of how we're holding these beliefs. Do we have to actively be thinking about them when we're acting,
Right.
what they call current beliefs? Or is it enough that we have a dispositional belief? Like it's something we agree with if asked, but we're not really thinking about it at that time.
This is a huge point of disagreement. So occurrentists believe that you have to be consciously aware that your action is wrong. And you have to be consciously thinking about the bad things that could happen when you're acting to be truly responsible.
Okay.
So if you aren't actively thinking those things, then you are ignorant,
Gotcha.
which might excuse you, unless, of course, that ignorance is itself blameworthy.
Right.
But then you have the dispositionalists who say that this is way too strict.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really line up with how we think about responsibility in everyday life.
Yeah.
Like, what if you just forget some key information? Like, imagine a caregiver who forgets that a child has a really bad allergy.
Oh, right.
They weren't actively thinking about it when they gave the kid the wrong food, but they should have remembered.
Right.
And that dispositional knowledge seems important when we're judging how responsible they are.
Right. For sure.
And what about when someone intentionally doesn't think about the moral downsides of their actions? It doesn't seem right to let them off the hook just because they didn't have a current belief about wrongdoing.
Right. I mean, the dispositional view says that those beliefs that are underlying and accessible can still be the awareness needed for moral responsibility. You
Exactly.
might not have been thinking about it at that exact moment, but it was there,
Yeah, just below the surface.
Exactly. So we've gone over the types and kinds of awareness that philosophers think are important when we're thinking about moral responsibility. Now, the encyclopedia, it takes this really interesting turn towards something called revisionism. This sounds like it could change how we think about blame. So get ready for this. This line of thinking, it says that unless we can connect wrongdoing back to someone consciously choosing to do something wrong, our everyday blame might be totally misplaced.
Yeah, this is a big one. So, like, it seems intuitive that responsibility and awareness are linked, especially when you're focusing on the need for a current awareness of overall wrongness. But this leads to a really challenging argument that Zimmerman really developed. And it suggests that many of our normal judgments about blame might be wrong.
So how does this regress argument even work? Let's go back to John and that light switch button.
Okay.
He really believes it's a light switch, so he has no idea that he's turning on the treadmill, that it could hurt Mary, or the moral implications of hurting someone.
Right, so his ignorance seems like a good excuse at first.
Right.
But, as we've already talked about, we might be able to hold him responsible for his ignorance. Maybe he didn't check the labels or he ignored warnings. So, to blame him for unintentionally harming Mary, we might have to blame him for his initial ignorance.
I see where this is going. So then we have to ask, what makes John blameworthy for being ignorant in the first place?
Right. So volitionists, the people who support this regress argument, they say that we don't have direct control over what we believe. This is doxastic involuntarism. We can't just choose to believe something because we want to.
Right. Okay.
So if John is blameworthy for his wrong belief about the button, it has to be because of something he did have control over that made him believe that.
Okay.
So they call this a benighting act. Maybe he just tossed out the instruction manual without even looking at it,
Oh,
but
okay.
then was throwing away the manual a blameworthy act. Yeah. Seems like we're going in circles.
Yeah, exactly. To blame him for getting rid of the manual, John would have had to be aware of what he was doing.
Right.
All the possible consequences, including not knowing things later, and the moral part of it all. And if he was also ignorant about why it's important to read instructions, then we'd have to find something he did before that that led to that ignorance.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. The regress, it just keeps going.
Yeah.
Maybe forever. Until you get to a point where the person acts knowing full well that what they are doing is wrong.
Okay.
A deliberate acratic act. They know it's wrong, but they do it anyway. The volitionists say that this is the only way to have original responsibility.
Yeah, yeah.
Every other blameworthy action is either like this or caused by one. So this is a crazier requirement and the origination thesis.
That's a pretty big conclusion. So it's saying that unless we can trace someone's bad actions back to when they knew it was wrong and still did it, they aren't really to blame, and we hardly ever use that standard when we blame people.
Exactly, and this has big implications for how we see things. It means that a lot of our everyday judgments about blame are probably wrong. And it's not just about adding extra steps to the blaming process. It suggests that actual blameworthy ignorant wrongdoing is probably super rare. They even apply this to moral ignorance. Imagine someone with really strong sexist beliefs who honestly doesn't think their harmful actions are wrong. This regress argument still works, which is what they call the parity thesis.
Okay.
All types of ignorance might be a good excuse unless they started with that initial acratic act.
That's a really interesting thought. So this whole idea really challenges how we normally think about responsibility. So no wonder there's been a lot of pushback on this revisionist view. What are some ways philosophers have responded?
Well, there are a few main ways they've responded. Each one questions a part of the regress argument. So one reaction is called weakened internalism. Philosophers who believe in this agree that you need some kind of awareness for responsibility, but they disagree with the revisionists. They don't think you need a fully conscious belief that something is wrong. to be responsible for the benighting act,
So they're basically saying that maybe those dispositional beliefs we talked about earlier can actually be enough.
right?
Like, even if John wasn't thinking it's wrong to not read the instructions when he threw out the manual, the fact that he probably would have agreed with that if you asked him could still be important for blaming him later for not knowing about the button.
Exactly. So they say that even if we're not actively thinking about a belief, it can still affect our reasons for acting
Okay.
or not acting.
Yeah.
Think about going for a walk in the park. You might be thinking that you need some fresh air, but you also believe that the park is nice,
Right.
and that contributes to your decision, even if you're not focusing on that belief. In the same way, someone might still be blameworthy for something wrong they did, even if their belief that it's wrong is only dispositional. Like, it's there under the surface.
They also bring up self-deception, right?
Yeah.
Like, someone could try to convince themselves that something isn't wrong, but deep down they know it is. And if they act because of that self-deception, it seems like they are still to blame.
Exactly. So the example of Susan and her taxes is a good one here.
Uh,
She might try to convince herself, maybe her friends are influencing her, that she doesn't have to pay taxes, but she probably still believes, deep down, that it's wrong to avoid your civic duties. If she acts against that belief, it suggests she knows more than what she's consciously thinking.
right.
Weekend internalists also say that maybe it's enough to be aware of a risk of doing something wrong,
Okay.
or to believe that there are good reasons not to do something, even if you don't completely believe the action is wrong.
So that's one way philosophers have pushed back, by saying you don't need to be totally aware of wrongdoing to be blamed. What's another way? The encyclopedia mentions something called ignorance and epistemic vices.
Yeah, so this one challenges the revisionist argument more directly. This view says that people can be blamed for not knowing something,
Okay.
and for the bad things they do, because they didn't know, even if they didn't know they were doing something wrong when they did the thing that made them ignorant.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand. So they're saying even if John didn't realize that he should read those instructions for the button, if he didn't do it because he's usually careless with information or he just ignores instructions, that's his fault.
Right, so that intellectual failing, or epistemic vice, is what makes him blameworthy, even if he wasn't thinking about it at the time.
Gotcha.
So Fitzpatrick has this really good example about Mr. Potter. He's this ruthless business owner who actually thinks that his aggressive and exploitative practices are totally fine. So even if he's morally ignorant about the harm he's causing, it's still his fault if it's because of these underlying epistemic vices that kept him from really thinking about the impact of his actions. This view changes the focus from what's happening in the person's mind at the moment of the benighting act to the person's character traits and intellectual habits that led to their ignorance.
But the encyclopedia points out a problem with this.
It might not be fair to expect someone with these vices to realize and fix their own ignorance. Like, if Mr. Potter really thinks he's a good judge of what's moral, why would he even question it?
Right. That's a really important point. So Levy says that you should only blame someone when it makes sense to expect them to be able to follow the rules. And being able to do that usually means that they have to be able to understand those rules and choose to follow them. If Mr. Potter doesn't think his overconfidence is a problem, he's not going to want to change his mind or get new information.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Then you have Montmarquet, who goes even further.
Okay.
He challenges the idea that we don't control what we believe. He thinks we have more control over our beliefs than we realize because we can choose how careful we are when we form them.
Interesting.
But then Zimmerman comes in and argues against that by saying forming beliefs isn't really an action in the same way that, like, whistling a tune is.
Mhm.
So this whole idea about epistemic vices highlights how our character and intellectual habits can play a role in our moral responsibility, even when we don't realize it. Now, the encyclopedia talks about a third response called the quality of will view. It sounds like this one might be moving away from focusing on awareness.
Exactly. That's the main point of this view. It comes from Strawson's work.
Okay.
And he says that we praise or blame people because of their underlying attitudes and how much they care about the well-being of others,
Okay.
which they call quality of will.
Mm.
According to this view, you don't necessarily have to believe that you're doing something wrong to be blamed for it.
Okay.
You're blamed because you're not showing enough care for others, which is what your action shows.
So, like with the historical example of the slaveholder, even if she really believed that slavery was okay, the fact that she was hurting someone and denying them basic rights shows that she didn't respect or care about that person, and that's why we blame her, regardless of whether she actually thought it was morally wrong.
Right. And people who believe in the quality of will view usually agree that you need to know what you are doing and what the consequences might be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But they say that the key factor isn't explicitly knowing that the action is morally wrong, the didicto-moral awareness.
Okay.
But even within this view, there's debate about whether you still need to be aware of the specific things about your action that are morally wrong, the de moral awareness. So, for example, Arpely uses the case of Huckleberry Finn to argue that even de awareness might not always be necessary.
Okay.
Because Huck does the right thing for the right reasons, out of compassion for Jim, even though he is confused about slavery.
That's a good point.
But then there's the counter-argument, which focuses on whether Huck really meant to do the right thing since he didn't actually believe it was right. The quality of will approach emphasizes the person's character and how much they care about others, instead of what they were thinking at the moment. And, as the encyclopedia points out, this view ends up projecting all four parts of the regress argument. It says that moral ignorance doesn't automatically excuse someone, and you can blame someone for harmful actions even if they didn't fully understand it was wrong.
Okay.
So Talbert, for instance, argues that even when someone is morally ignorant, their actions can still show contempt or disregard for other people, and that is why we can blame them. But this view also has some criticism.
Uh-huh.
People say if someone genuinely couldn't have known better, is it fair to blame them? This shows a fundamental disagreement about what responsibility even is. Is it about being accountable based on what we are capable of and what's expected of us? Or is it more about what we can attribute to someone based on their moral compass and the attitudes they show through their actions?
That's a big difference. So the last response to the revisionist challenge that the encyclopedia talks about is called capacitarianism.
Right.
It sounds like this one is even more different from the usual focus on being aware.
It is. So capacitarianism argues that we can blame people directly even when they're totally unaware of what they're doing, including when they don't know the facts. The main idea is that if you were able to be aware of the important moral facts, and you should have been aware of them, meaning there were rules or expectations for you to be aware, and you could have been aware of them, meaning you had the mental ability to do so, then not being aware is enough to be responsible, even if you didn't actually know or have any bad intentions.
So this hot dog case, where Alessandra forgets her dog in a hot car and something really bad happens, is a big example for this view. She didn't mean to hurt her dog, and it wasn't because she was being mean, but a lot of people still feel like it's her fault.
Exactly. And capacitarians try to explain this by focusing on the rules that say Alessandra should have known it was dangerous to leave a dog in a hot car. And the mental abilities that show she could have known, like her memory and attention, and why should have known and could have known together means she's morally responsible. They don't agree with the revisionist idea that blame for unknowing actions always comes from a previous fully aware act.
Okay.
And they also don't think you always have to be aware of the facts to be directly blamed.
But this view also brings up a bunch of questions. What are those rules of awareness exactly?
Yeah.
How do we figure out if someone really could have known better, especially if they clearly didn't? And the biggest question is, how does should have known and could have known make someone morally to blame if they didn't even know or mean any harm?
These are the big challenges for capacitarianism.
Yeah.
They often argue that we have rules about awareness because of our general moral rules. We should be aware of things that are important for fulfilling our moral duties to others.
Okay.
And they point to different mental abilities like attention, memory, and recognizing important information. But people criticize this. They say that we don't really control these abilities all the time. And they question if messing up with these abilities can really make us morally blameworthy. And then there are questions about how we even define and say someone has these unexercised capacities. Are we just making up scenarios about what they could have done?
Right.
And are we interpreting their past behavior in a biased way?
Yeah.
And like the encyclopedia highlights in its discussion of Cher,
Yeah.
the core question is still, why is just having the ability to know, but without actually knowing or meaning to do something bad, enough to blame someone?
Right.
So Cher has this origination view. He says that we blame someone when their lack of awareness is a problem. And that problem is caused by the person's basic attitudes, habits, and personality traits, even if those traits aren't actually moral flaws themselves. But some people don't agree with this origination view. They say that just because something caused something else doesn't mean you should be morally blamed. They question if there's really a strong enough connection between someone's traits and their lack of awareness to justify blaming them. And they also say that Comparing a conscious choice to an unintentional action that's based on someone's traits isn't really fair.
So, this seemingly simple question of whether and how our awareness affects moral responsibility actually takes us to a whole world of philosophical
It
ideas.
really does.
There's a lot of different points of view and no easy
Oh,
answers.
sure.
This deep dive into the epistemic condition for moral responsibility has helped us all act like philosophers
Yeah.
and navigate all these complex debates. It's been really interesting to see how different philosophical ideas try to understand and evaluate how people act. We talked about the different kinds of awareness, the challenges of the regress argument, and all the different ways philosophers try to make our gut feelings about blame fit with logical thinking.
And hopefully it's given you, the listener, some new and interesting things to think about.
Absolutely. So, to wrap up our philosophical journey, here's something to think about. Think of a time when you did something without really thinking about all the consequences. Now, thinking about all the philosophical frameworks we discussed, how do you see that situation now? And your own responsibility?
Yeah, what kind of awareness do you think is most important when deciding if we should hold ourselves or others accountable?
That's a really good question. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's made you think about these philosophical puzzles in new ways.
Thanks for listening.